They told me to wear black. "It's a funeral," my daughter said, her voice clipped and rehearsed as if she were delivering lines from a script written by someone who had long since forgotten what grief really felt like. But the moment I stepped into that room full of laughter, pastel dresses, and champagne toasts, I realized I was the only one truly mourning. I was surrounded by smiles and stories that painted him, a man who had abandoned us decades ago, as some sort of tragic hero, a flawed soul worthy of celebration rather than sorrow. I stood there in my black dress, a silent shadow amid the brightness, a living contradiction to the colorful narrative they had woven around his death. "My name is Evelyn. I'm 81 years old and I live alone in a modest apartment overlooking the freeway, where the constant hum of traffic is a reminder that life keeps moving, whether you want it to or not. This evening was supposed to be a farewell, a chance for family to come together and find closure. But for me, it was the opening scene of a play I never auditioned for, where the script erased the most vital chapters of my life and left me with nothing but the role of the mourner no one else seemed willing to be. I remember the day my daughter called, asking me to come to this celebration of life. She sounded hopeful, as if by showing up I could help mend fences long since broken, as if my presence could somehow soften the sharp edges of our fractured family history. "Wear black," she said, as if that color alone could summon the proper mood, the right kind of respect. She didn't mention that the rest of the family would be dressed in light, cheerful colors, that the house would smell of flowers and wine, or that the atmosphere would be one of festive remembrance rather than quiet mourning. When I arrived, I was greeted with polite nods and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. The room was filled with people I barely recognized. Some were family, others friends of the deceased, but their laughter felt foreign to me, like they were actors playing roles I had no part in. Photographs lined the walls, showcasing a man who seemed more myth than memory. He was captured mid-laugh, hands wrapped around glasses, surrounded by adoring faces that rarely included mine. I searched for one image that connected me to the past, to the years when I was more than just an afterthought, but the pictures were carefully curated to exclude the messy truth of our lives together. As I moved through the room, I felt invisible, as though my presence was an uncomfortable punctuation mark in a story rewritten to suit their version of the past. My grandchildren glanced away when I approached. My daughter's husband barely acknowledged me, and even my own daughter seemed hesitant to let me speak or be seen. The speeches began shortly after I arrived, each one a polished eulogy that glossed over the pain and betrayal I carried like a shadow. They spoke of him as a man who tried, who loved in his own way, who was more misunderstood than cruel. I clenched my fists around the glass I was handed, the cold weight grounding me even as my heart pounded with the urge to shout the truth no one wanted to hear. But I stayed silent. At least at first, because I knew that breaking the veneer of this carefully constructed narrative would make me the villain in a story where I was supposed to be the grieving widow, not the woman who had survived abandonment and erasure. Sitting there, surrounded by the hum of conversation and clinking glasses, I thought about the years I had spent holding my family together, the nights I had cried alone while he chased his own dreams and left us behind. I remembered the bills I had paid single-handedly, the birthday parties I had planned without thanks, and the moments when my own children looked at me with something I couldn't quite name, a mixture of pity, discomfort, and resentment. It was a cruel irony that now, as he lay dying, they all gathered to celebrate a man who had never truly been present for any of us when it mattered most. And here I was, dressed in black, a living monument to a grief they had long ago buried under layers of denial and convenience. The silence inside me grew louder with every toast, every fond memory recounted, without mention of the years he was absent, the promises broken, the pain inflicted with careless words and silent departures. I felt the weight of my own story pressing against the walls of that room, begging for acknowledgement, for justice in the form of recognition, if not forgiveness. Yet, no one asked me to speak. No one invited me to share my version of our life. I was there to witness the rewriting of history, to nod politely and smile at the parts they wanted me to see, while the truth of my experience was swept under the rug like an inconvenient stain. As the evening wore on, I found myself retreating to the edge of the gathering, watching the faces that barely knew me laugh and reminisce as if I were a ghost, a relic from a past they preferred not to acknowledge. The disconnect was painful, a reminder that sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who do the most damage, not through violence or loud betrayals, but through silence, omission, and the rewriting of stories to erase the parts that don't fit, the image they want to project. It was in that moment, standing alone in a room full of people who had forgotten me, that I understood something vital. I was the only one truly mourning. My grief was not just for the man we were celebrating, but for the years lost, for the love denied, and for the family that had chosen to forget me as easily as they had chosen to remember him. I left that night with a hollow ache in my chest and a quiet resolve growing inside me. They had invited me to wear black as a symbol of respect, but I knew that color could not contain the complexity of my feelings. My mourning was not just for a man's death, but for the life I had lost to his absence and the family that had chosen to erase me. I wore the black dress like armor, a testament to the pain that still lived in me, but also as a shield against the false narrative being told in that room. This story is mine to tell now, in the quiet hours when the world feels still, when I can sit with my memories without fear of being silenced or unseen. I am Evelyn, 81 years old, a woman who has learned that grief is not always shared, and that sometimes, to honor your own pain, you must stand alone. The moment that shattered the fragile balance of my existence arrived quietly, disguised as a simple phone call from my daughter, Rachel, who had been so careful to control every detail of the funeral celebration. Her voice, though calm on the surface, carried an urgency that unsettled me more than any raised tone could have. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, as if the words themselves were heavy with unspoken consequences. I had already sensed the distance growing between us, the slow erosion of what little connection remained after years of silence and half-truths, but I wasn't prepared for the news she delivered. The man they had gathered to honor, the man whose life had been painted in glowing hues despite his absence from mine, was gone. His final breath exhaled quietly in a hospital bed far from the family's celebration. But the truth was more complicated, tangled in the web of appearances and secrets Rachel had spent years weaving around herself and the rest of the family. She told me that Charles had left instructions to keep the funeral light, a celebration of the good times, a way to avoid the bitterness that often poisoned such gatherings. He had wanted laughter, music, and stories that would soften the edges of a life filled with regrets, but also moments of joy. Rachel insisted that this was his final wish, and that everyone was determined to honor it. The word honor felt like a knife twisting in my chest, a cruel reminder that the man who had left me alone with the children, who had disappeared without explanation or apology, was now the center of a family narrative that excluded me. When she asked if I would come, I hesitated. Part of me longed to be there, to bear witness, to say goodbye in my own way. But another part recoiled at the thought of stepping into a room where I would be the only mourner, the only one willing to acknowledge the fractures beneath the surface. Rachel tried to reassure me, her voice softening with the practiced gentleness she reserved for moments of emotional negotiation. "It's not about him or us," she said. "It's about closure. For everyone." But I knew better. Closure for her meant smoothing the edges of a story too painful to confront, rewriting history to fit the version that allowed them all to move forward without reckoning with the past. I agreed to come, not because I believed in the charade, but because I wanted to see for myself the world they had built without me, to measure the distance between us and perhaps find a way back across it. What I found was a scene more fitting for a celebration than a farewell, a gathering where grief was a distant memory and the wounds of abandonment were glossed over with polite conversation and carefully curated smiles. The catalyst for my journey into this strange new reality was not a single moment, but a series of small betrayals that accumulated until the truth could no longer be ignored. It began with the invitation itself, phrased in language that suggested inclusion but felt like exclusion. The request that I wear black, a color of mourning, while the rest of the family dressed in pastels and light fabrics, was the first hint that I was being set apart, marked as other. When I arrived, the divide was palpable. The house was filled with people who treated me as a guest rather than family, who nodded politely but avoided eye contact, who whispered about the past in tones that excluded me from the narrative. I realized then that my presence was tolerated at best, a symbol rather than a participant, a token of grief in a room determined to forget the pain. The speeches that followed only deepened the sense of estrangement. One after another, voices rose to paint a portrait of Charles that was at once flattering and misleading. They spoke of his kindness, his generosity, his struggles with illness and regret, but never of the nights he was absent, the promises he broke, the children he left behind. My daughter Rachel delivered the most polished of these eulogies, her words rehearsed and careful, designed to present a unified front to the gathered crowd. She spoke of forgiveness and understanding, of the importance of remembering the good, but in her eyes I saw the flicker of something else, guilt, perhaps, or fear of the truth I represented. As she finished, applause rippled through the room, but I felt no part of it. I sat stiffly in my chair, the weight of the black fabric pressing against my skin, a reminder that I was the only one carrying the true burden of loss. The catalyst reached its peak when, after the formal proceedings, the room opened into a casual reception filled with laughter and easy conversation. It was then that I overheard a whispered exchange between two relatives who had long ago distanced themselves from me. They spoke in hushed tones about the drama Mom always brings, about how it was better to let the past stay buried, about how she had made her choice to leave and now had to live with it. The words cut deeper than any argument, slicing through the fragile hope I had clung to for reconciliation. In that moment, I understood that my mourning was not shared, that my grief was a solitary act of remembrance in a family that had moved on without me. That evening, as I left the gathering and walked alone to my car under a sky heavy with clouds, the catalyst settled inside me like a slow poison and a clarifying fire all at once. It forced me to confront the reality I had been avoiding, that the family I had known was no longer mine, that the roles we once played had been rewritten without my consent, and that to reclaim my voice I would have to step away from the expectations they imposed. The black dress I had worn, once a symbol of obedience to their wishes, became a badge of defiance, a marker of my decision to honor my own grief on my own terms. This moment, born of quiet exclusion and painful revelation, set me on a path away from the shadows they had cast and toward the light of my own truth. In the days that followed, I grappled with the complex emotions the catalyst had unleashed: anger, sorrow, betrayal, and a fragile hope for something more. I thought about the years spent trying to hold a fractured family together, about the sacrifices made in silence, about the moments when I had been erased from the story told around dinner tables and holiday gatherings. The catalyst was not merely the death of a man, but the death of an illusion. The illusion that family meant unconditional love and inclusion. It was the moment I realized that to survive, I had to stop waiting for their recognition and begin living for myself. This realization, painful and liberating, became the engine driving my journey forward. the spark that would ignite the slow but steady reclaiming of my life and my dignity. Looking back, I see the catalyst as both an end and a beginning. It ended the pretense of unity and love that had masked years of neglect and emotional abandonment, but it also began a new chapter, one where I no longer needed to seek permission to exist, to feel, to remember. It was the moment I took the first step away from the shadows of a past that had tried to erase me and toward a future defined by my own choices and my own voice. The catalyst was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, persistent turning, a turning away from what was lost and toward what could still be found in the depths of my own resilience and strength. This story is not about vengeance or bitterness, though those feelings surfaced in the wake of the catalyst. It is about recognition of the pain that was real, the love that was denied, and the courage it takes to stand alone in a room full of people who have forgotten you. The catalyst forced me to see that mourning is not always a shared journey, and that sometimes the greatest act of love we can give ourselves is the permission to grieve on our own terms, to tell our own story, and to reclaim the dignity that was never taken, only forgotten. In this way, the catalyst was not just an event, but a revelation, a call to wakefulness and to action that would shape the rest of my life. After the funeral celebration that had felt more like a theater production than a true farewell, the days that followed unfolded with a quiet but unmistakable shift in the fabric of my life. The catalyst, the moment of painful recognition that I was the only one mourning and the only one who remembered the full story, began to ripple outward, creating waves of change that were subtle yet relentless. This first escalation was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by the slow, steady tightening of invisible cords around my sense of belonging and worth, a gradual shrinking of the space I once occupied in the lives of those I called family. It was in these small, often overlooked moments that the true weight of exclusion settled in, weaving its way into my days and nights like a creeping fog. In the weeks after the funeral, I found myself increasingly sidelined. Phone calls from my daughter became less frequent and more guarded, as if she were trying to maintain a careful distance while still fulfilling some obligation. The texts that did come were brief and impersonal, messages more about logistics or updates than genuine connection. Invitations to family gatherings came with caveats or were extended through intermediaries, leaving me with the unmistakable feeling that my presence was tolerated only when convenient and never truly welcomed. I was no longer the mother, the grandmother, the woman who had been a central figure in the family's story. Instead, I had become a peripheral character, a reminder of old wounds best left unopened. The house that once echoed with the sound of children's laughter and the warmth of shared meals now felt like a museum I was no longer allowed to visit. My daughter's home, the place where I had spent countless holidays and milestones, became a carefully managed stage where memories were curated and edited. When I was invited, it was as a guest, not as family. When I sat at the table, I was an outsider looking in. The casual questions about my health and my plans were thinly veiled attempts to gauge how much longer I would remain on the periphery before disappearing altogether. At times, I caught glimpses of pity in my grandchildren's eyes, a silent question of how to relate to a grandmother who had become a stranger in her own right. This slow exclusion was accompanied by a parallel erasure of my history. Family stories I had once told with pride were retold without me. Details changed or omitted to fit the new narrative they preferred. The man we had gathered to honor, Charles, was spoken of with selective memory, his flaws softened or ignored, while my role in the family's survival was quietly forgotten. I found myself left out of conversations where my insights and recollections would have been valuable, my voice replaced by others who told a different version of our shared past. It was as if the chapters of my life that involved love, sacrifice, and resilience were being overwritten by a collective amnesia that served to protect their image of harmony. One of the most painful aspects of this first escalation was the subtle control exerted through boundaries and limitations placed around me. Invitations arrived with restrictions. Come for a short visit, leave before dinner, attend the party but stay in the designated family-friend area. Be present but don't speak up. These invisible fences confined me to a role that was safe for them, but suffocating for me. I began to feel like a ghost, haunting the edges of a world that no longer recognized me as real. The quietness of these boundaries made them harder to challenge, as any attempt to push back was met with polite resistance or gentle reminders of my place. I also noticed how my daughter's demeanor changed when I was around. The warmth that once softened her words grew colder, her smiles more practiced. She seemed to shrink away from the mother who had once been her closest ally, as if afraid that acknowledging our shared pain might unravel the careful facade she maintained. Conversations that might have once been filled with laughter and tears were now reduced to safe topics and surface-level exchanges. The emotional distance between us widened with each interaction, leaving me to grapple with a loneliness that was both acute and profound. In the midst of this escalating isolation, I sought solace in small acts of reclaiming my dignity. I began to spend more time walking alone in the nearby park, letting the quiet rustle of leaves and the distant chatter of birds soothe the ache inside me. I returned to writing letters I never sent, pouring out the stories and feelings that had been silenced for so long. At night, I sat by my window, watching the city lights flicker, and allowed myself to mourn not only the man who had died, but the family that had forgotten how to hold me close. These moments of solitude were both a balm and a reminder of the distance I needed to cross. One evening, I received a message from a distant cousin I hadn't heard from in years. She wrote simply, "I see you and I'm sorry." Those words, brief and unadorned, were like a lifeline thrown across the chasm of estrangement. They reminded me that while some had chosen to forget, others still remembered. This quiet connection became a thread of hope in the fabric of my days, a sign that the story of my life was not entirely erased. Yet despite these small sparks, the first escalation pressed on. Invitations became rarer, visits shorter. I was increasingly referred to as Mom's friend or the family elder, titles that distanced me from the role I had once held so naturally. Even family events I had attended for decades were reimagined without me, as if my absence had become a new tradition. This slow unraveling was not marked by shouting or dramatic confrontations, but by a gradual withdrawal, a soft exclusion that was harder to fight because it wore the mask of civility. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself at a crossroads. The first escalation was a painful shrinking, but it also illuminated the path forward. It became clear that if I wanted to survive this erasure, I had to begin the process of reclaiming my own identity outside the confines of a family that no longer saw me. This realization was both terrifying and liberating. It meant acknowledging that the life I had known was changing irrevocably, but it also opened the door to a future where I could define myself on my own terms. In the quiet moments of reflection, I understood that the first escalation was not the end, but a necessary part of my journey. It stripped away the illusions and forced me to confront the truth of my situation. It was a painful but vital step toward healing and self-discovery. The slow tightening of distance and control revealed the fractures in the family's facade, but it also sparked the first flicker of my own resilience. I began to see that while I might be excluded from their version of family, I was not powerless. The journey ahead would require courage and patience, but it was mine to take. This phase of first escalation was marked by a deepening solitude, but it was also the soil in which new strength began to grow. I started to seek out connections beyond the family circle, rekindling old friendships and exploring new communities where I could belong without conditions or judgments. The black dress I wore at the funeral became less a symbol of mourning and more a cloak of survival, a testament to the woman who refused to be forgotten. Each day, I learned to live with the quiet ache of exclusion while nurturing the flickering hope of renewal. The first escalation taught me that sometimes the most profound battles are fought in silence, in the spaces between words and gestures, in the slow retreat from a world that no longer welcomes you. It was a test of endurance and faith, a crucible in which my sense of self was challenged and reshaped. Though the path was lonely, it was also a path toward freedom, the freedom to grieve, to remember, and ultimately to reclaim the life that had been overshadowed for too long. In this way, the first escalation was both a loss and a beginning. It was the quiet unmaking of one life and the tentative making of another. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to walk it, step by careful step, holding on to the fragments of my past while reaching for the promise of a future defined by my own voice and my own choices. The turning point in my journey arrived not with a grand announcement or a sudden confrontation, but with a quiet moment of clarity that settled over me like a dawn breaking after a long night. For so long, I had lived under the weight of invisibility, sidelined by the very people who once called me mother and grandmother, reduced to a ghost in my own family's story. The first escalation had tightened its grip, shrinking my world to a solitary existence marked by polite neglect and silent exclusion. Yet in the midst of that solitude, something inside me began to stir, a deep, persistent whisper urging me to reclaim the narrative that had been taken from me. This was my midpoint, the subtle but profound shift from passive endurance to active agency. The moment I chose to stop waiting for recognition and start forging a life that belonged to me alone. It began with a simple act, a decision to walk away from the spaces where I was only tolerated and to seek out places where I could be seen and heard. The first step was to leave behind the familiar routines that had once defined my role within the family, routines that now felt like chains rather than connections. I found myself drawn to the quiet streets near my apartment, to the small cafes where strangers smiled without reservation, and the faces around me did not carry the weight of unspoken judgment. I began to explore the city with new eyes, noticing the details I had missed in years of emotional preoccupation, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, the scent of fresh bread from a bakery around the corner, the warmth of a friendly nod from a passerby. These small moments of connection became the threads from which I would weave a new tapestry of belonging. With each step away from the shadows of my past, I discovered pockets of community that welcomed me not as a relic of family history, but as a woman with her own story to tell. I joined a local book club where conversations flowed freely and opinions were valued regardless of age or background. I volunteered at a neighborhood garden, finding solace in the rhythm of planting and nurturing life, a metaphor for my own growth and renewal. These experiences nourished a part of me that had long been dormant, the part that craved engagement, purpose, and the simple joy of being known for who I truly was rather than who I had been relegated to be. For the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of hope, a fragile but insistent belief that I could create a life beyond the confines of loss and exclusion. This shift was also deeply internal. I began to reflect on the years spent trying to hold together a family that no longer needed me in the ways I had imagined. I acknowledged the pain and betrayal that had marked those years, but I also recognized the resilience that had carried me through. The black dress I had worn at the funeral, the symbol of my solitary mourning, now hung quietly in my closet, a reminder not of loss alone, but of survival. I allowed myself to grieve fully, not just for the man who had died, but for the life I had hoped to share with my family. And as I grieved, I also began to forgive, not to absolve those who had hurt me, but to free myself from the heavy burden of anger and resentment. Forgiveness became an act of liberation, a way to reclaim my power and my peace. At this midpoint, I also took practical steps to build the life I envisioned. I found a part-time job at a community center where I could contribute and connect with others in meaningful ways. The work was modest but fulfilling, a daily reminder that my worth was not defined by the approval of my family, but by the impact I could have on the world around me. I enrolled in a writing workshop, tentatively sharing my stories and discovering the strength in my own voice. The act of putting words to paper was transformative, a way to assert my presence and claim my history on my own terms. Each sentence written was a step toward healing, a stitch in the fabric of a new identity woven from the threads of experience, pain, and hope. The emotional landscape of this midpoint was complex, a mixture of sorrow and strength, loss and possibility. I felt the ache of separation from those I had loved and lost, but I also felt the thrill of discovering parts of myself that had been hidden or suppressed. The quiet moments alone with my thoughts became a sanctuary where I could explore the depths of my feelings without fear of judgment or dismissal. I learned to sit with discomfort, to hold the contradictions within me, and to embrace the uncertainty of a future that was still unfolding. This inward journey was as important as the outward changes, for it laid the foundation upon which the rest of my healing and growth would rest. This phase also brought unexpected encounters that reinforced my sense of possibility. A neighbor, a widow like myself, became a companion in this new chapter, sharing stories of loss and resilience over cups of tea on lazy afternoons. A chance meeting at the bookstore introduced me to a young woman who admired my courage and saw in me a mentor and friend. These relationships, built not on obligation but on mutual respect and affection, were balm to a heart that had known too much solitude. They reminded me that connection is possible at any stage of life, that new bonds can form even after old ones have frayed. The midpoint was not without its challenges. There were moments of doubt and loneliness, when the pull of the familiar, the old patterns of silence and waiting, tempted me to retreat. The voices of family members who still clung to their version of the past echoed in my mind, their judgments and dismissals threatening to drown out the newfound clarity I had gained. But each time I faltered, I found strength in the small victories, the completed writing assignment, the smile from a stranger, the quiet satisfaction of a day spent doing meaningful work. These moments became the anchor that held me steady as I navigated the uncertain waters of change. Looking back, I see the midpoint as the heart of my journey, a moment when I moved from being a passive witness to my own life to becoming an active participant in its unfolding. It was the moment I claimed my right to exist fully and authentically, outside the shadows of grief and neglect. The black dress, once a shroud, became a symbol of my transformation, a reminder that even in darkness, there is the potential for light. This turning point set the stage for the challenges and triumphs that lay ahead, for the second escalation and the ultimate reclaiming of my voice and my life. This part of the story is not just about loss or survival. It is about the power of choice, the choice to step forward into the unknown, to embrace vulnerability and strength in equal measure, and to believe that a new chapter is always possible. It is about the quiet courage it takes to break free from the past and to build a future that honors the whole of who we are, not just the parts others want to see. And it is about the simple, profound truth that even when we stand alone, we are never truly lost. The second escalation unfolded like a storm gathering on the horizon, slow at first, barely noticeable, but growing in intensity until it demanded attention and forced a reckoning I could no longer avoid. After the quiet but determined steps I had taken to reclaim my life and my sense of self, the past began to reach out with insistent fingers, pulling at the fragile threads of my new existence. The family that had once sidelined me now sought to reassert control, wielding concern and obligation as weapons in a subtle campaign to draw me back into a narrative I was desperate to escape. This escalation was not marked by open hostility or explosive confrontation. Instead, it was a relentless series of pressures, reminders, and tests designed to unsettle my footing and challenge the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. It started with a letter. The envelope was plain, unmarked except for my name in familiar handwriting, the kind that stirred a mixture of warmth and apprehension in my heart. It was from my grandson, Kieran, the one who had always been the gentlest among them, the only family member who had dared to reach out without judgment or expectation. His letter was filled with concern and tenderness, expressing a hope to understand and reconnect, to bridge the distance that had grown between us. Reading his words, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't dared to feel in a long time, a possibility of reconciliation, a thread of hope woven through the tangled fabric of estrangement. Yet the letter also served as a stark reminder of the gulf that separated us, of the walls built by years of silence and pain. Shortly after receiving Kieran's letter, I found myself facing an unexpected visit. Lisa, my daughter's sister-in-law, appeared at the community center where I volunteered, her presence as unannounced as it was unwelcome. She was dressed impeccably, as always, with a controlled smile that barely concealed the tension beneath. Her eyes searched mine, weighing and measuring, as if trying to gauge how much of the woman she once dismissed still remained. Lisa spoke cautiously, her words laced with a kind of false concern that barely hid her true intent. She told me about the family's worries, their fear for my well-being, and their desire to help me get back on track. It was an offer wrapped in threat, a reminder that my autonomy was conditional and that stepping outside their expectations came at a price. This visit was a turning point, a clear signal that the family was not willing to let me go without a fight. Lisa's presence was both a test and a challenge, an assertion of power cloaked in the language of care. She brought news of Adam, my son, who had hired a lawyer to represent the family's interests. The lawyer's letter arrived soon after, formal and cold, outlining concerns about my safety and financial matters, implying that decisions might be made on my behalf if I continued to resist their involvement. The legal language was a barricade, a way to exert control from a distance, to frame my independence as a risk and a problem to be managed. It was a stark reminder that my fight for self-determination was not just against memories and emotions, but against a system determined to maintain its hold. Amidst this pressure, the media entered the fray. An article appeared in the community section of a local newspaper, framed as a human interest piece about a missing matriarch, whose family was publicly expressing concern. The photograph chosen was one from years ago, a picture that captured a smile I no longer recognized as mine. The article quoted family members expressing worry and confusion over my disappearance, portraying me as vulnerable and in need of protection. Reading those words, I felt a wave of indignation and sorrow. The story they told was not mine. It was a narrative constructed to elicit sympathy while stripping me of agency. The portrayal of vulnerability felt like an insult, a way to infantilize me and dismiss the choices I had made to live on my own terms. This public exposure intensified the private pressures. Calls and messages flooded my phone, mostly from family members and their representatives, each one a variation on the same theme. Come home, make peace, let us care for you. The voices on the other end ranged from pleading to accusatory, from tentative to demanding. Some messages suggested that I was punishing the family, that my absence was a betrayal rather than a boundary. Others were veiled threats, warning of consequences if I continued down this path of independence. The cumulative weight of these communications was exhausting and disorienting, a relentless tide that threatened to erode the calm I had fought to establish. Yet, amidst this onslaught, there were moments of unexpected grace and clarity. Kieran's continued outreach was a beacon in the storm, a reminder that connection was still possible, despite the barriers. His visits were tentative but genuine, marked by a quiet respect that allowed me to feel seen without pressure. We spoke of many things, not always about the past, but about the small details of life, the books we read, the weather, the simple pleasure of shared silence. These moments were fragile and precious, offering a glimpse of what family could be when stripped of expectations and judgment. However, the return of the past was not solely an external battle. Internally, I wrestled with conflicting emotions: love and resentment, hope and fear, the desire for reconciliation, and the need for self-preservation. The pressure from family members stirred old wounds, reopening the pain of years spent being overlooked and undervalued. I found myself questioning the cost of independence, wondering if the price of freedom was loneliness and alienation. Yet deep within, a resolve solidified. I understood that true peace would not come from capitulation, but from standing firm in my truth, from defining my life by my own terms rather than their expectations. The second escalation also brought unexpected allies. Friends I had made in my new community offered support and encouragement, helping me navigate the emotional turbulence. Their presence reminded me that family is not solely defined by blood, but by the bonds we choose and nurture. These relationships were a source of strength, providing a foundation from which I could resist the tides of pressure and reclaim my narrative. I began to understand that my story was not confined to the roles imposed by my family, but was part of a larger tapestry of resilience and reinvention. As the escalation reached its peak, I made deliberate choices to assert my boundaries. I responded to the lawyer's letter with a clear and firm statement of my wishes, affirming my capacity to make decisions and rejecting any interference that was not invited. I declined invitations that felt like traps, choosing instead to invest in relationships that honored my autonomy. I continued to write letters, to Kieran, to myself, and even to family members, expressing my feelings with honesty and without apology. These acts were not defiance for its own sake, but affirmations of my right to live authentically and with dignity. The emotional landscape during this period was turbulent and complex. There were days when the weight of isolation and rejection threatened to overwhelm me, when tears came unbidden and despair whispered in the quiet moments. But there were also days of unexpected joy and connection, when laughter echoed in a cafe or a warm embrace from a friend chased away the shadows. The second escalation was a crucible that tested my limits, but also revealed the depth of my strength and capacity for growth. Looking back, I see the second escalation as the crucible in which my resolve was forged. It was a period of confrontation and challenge that demanded I clarify my values and commitments. The pressures from family and society served as mirrors, reflecting the lingering wounds and fears that needed healing. Through this process, I learned that reclaiming one's life after betrayal and exclusion is not a linear journey, but a complex dance of resistance and surrender, of holding on and letting go. This phase also highlighted the power dynamics inherent in family and societal relationships, revealing how concern can be weaponized and how love can be entangled with control. It underscored the importance of self-advocacy and the courage required to maintain boundaries in the face of pressure. Ultimately, the second escalation was a call to deepen my commitment to myself, to stand firmly in my truth, and to embrace the uncertain but hopeful path ahead. In the midst of this turbulence, I've found moments of peace in small rituals: morning walks, writing in my journal, quiet conversations with friends. These practices became anchors, grounding me in my identity and providing refuge from the storm. They reminded me that healing is a process, not a destination, and that the journey toward wholeness is marked by both setbacks and breakthroughs. As I navigated the second escalation, I came to understand that power is not only held by those who seek to control, but also by those who claim their voice and agency. My story became one of reclamation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of transformation even in the face of profound challenges. The family that tried to rewrite my narrative could not erase the truth of my experience, nor could they diminish the strength I had cultivated through years of survival. This chapter of my life was not easy, nor was it without loss. Yet it was also rich with lessons and growth, with the emergence of a new self who refused to be defined by pain or exclusion. It was a declaration that I was more than the roles assigned to me, more than the mistakes and disappointments of the past. I was a woman who had endured, who had loved fiercely, and who was now learning to live freely. The second escalation was a storm. Yes, but storms clear the air. They strip away the old and make space for new life to emerge. And so, amidst the turmoil, I found a deeper clarity and a firmer foundation on which to build the next chapter of my journey. A chapter marked not by silence, but by voice. Not by invisibility, but by presence. Not by fear, but by courage. The moment I had both feared and longed for arrived not with fanfare or confrontation, but with the quiet inevitability of a winter dusk settling over a long day. After months of navigating the tides of pressure, exclusion, and half-hearted attempts at reconciliation, I found myself standing at the crossroads where the past and future met in sharp relief, demanding a choice that would define not only how I saw myself, but how the world would see me. The culmination of this journey, the climax of years spent carrying burdens no one acknowledged, was not a grand spectacle, but a deliberate act of reclaiming my voice, my story, and my dignity in a way that could never be undone. The occasion was a gathering organized by the family to discuss next steps, a phrase that dripped with the promise of control, masked as concern. The venue was a sterile conference room in a legal office, a place chosen to remind me of the weight of their authority and the limits of my autonomy. Around the table sat familiar faces, my son Adam, his wife Lisa, the lawyer they had appointed, and a few others whose presence underscored the seriousness of the meeting. Their eyes held a mixture of impatience, judgment, and a grudging respect for the woman they hoped would finally acquiesce. But I was no longer the silent, compliant figure they expected. I was a woman transformed by the journey from invisibility to agency, and this moment was my chance to assert the power I had reclaimed. I began by listening, letting their words wash over me, their concerns about my safety, their suggestions for assisted living, the thinly veiled warnings about legal consequences if I resisted. They spoke in terms that sought to diminish my capacity, to frame my independence as a risk that needed managing. But as they spoke, I felt a calm rising within me, a steadiness forged in the fires of betrayal and resilience. When my turn came, I stood slowly, the black dress from the funeral a silent witness to the strength I now carried. My voice, steady and clear, cut through the tension like a blade. "I am not your project to manage," I said, each word deliberate and unyielding. "I am not a problem to be solved or a liability to be contained. I am a woman of sound mind, capable of making my own decisions and responsible for my own life." The room fell silent, the weight of my declaration settling like dust in the stale air. I continued, refusing to let their concerns dismiss the years of experience, pain, and growth that had brought me to this point. For too long, I have been written out of my own story, reduced to a shadow behind your version of family. But I am here to say that story ends today. I spoke of the quiet courage it took to step away, to build a life beyond the reach of those who would control me. I spoke of the loneliness and the strength, the moments of despair and the sparks of hope. I named the betrayals without anger, but with clarity, exposing the fractures in the facade they had maintained. "I do not seek your approval or forgiveness," I said. "I seek only the respect owed to any human being, to be seen, to be heard, and to be free. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Adam's jaw tightened. Lisa's eyes flickered with a mix of disbelief and something closer to fear. Then I handed over a letter, one I had drafted carefully, a formal statement asserting my rights and boundaries, notifying them of the legal counsel I had retained and my refusal to be subjected to further interference. "This is not a threat," I said softly, "but a clear boundary. Any attempts to contact me under the guise of concern will be considered harassment and met with appropriate response." The room was still, the power dynamics momentarily suspended by the weight of my words and the certainty of my stance. What followed was a mixture of stunned silence and restrained responses. Adam tried to argue, to appeal to family loyalty, but I interrupted gently yet firmly. "Family is not a tool for control," I reminded him. "It is a bond of respect and love. I have loved you all in my own way, but love does not mean submission or erasure." Lisa's voice cracked as she tried to explain their perspective, but I saw through the carefully constructed veneer. I was no longer willing to play the role of the compliant mother or grandmother, the silent witness to their version of events. As the meeting drew to a close, I felt a profound sense of closure and release. I had spoken my truth in a space where silence had long been expected, and in doing so, I had reclaimed the narrative that was rightfully mine. I left the room not with triumph or vengeance, but with the quiet dignity of a woman who had finally stood fully in her own power. The act was irreversible, not because of legal documents or formal declarations, but because of the inner transformation that made acquiescence impossible. Walking away from that place, I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders, replaced by a steady lightness. The black dress, once a symbol of mourning and invisibility, now felt like armor forged from truth and resilience. I understood that this climax was not an end but a turning point, a moment of profound self-assertion that would shape the course of my life from that day forward. I had faced the forces that sought to diminish me and emerged whole, unbroken, and unapologetically myself. In the days that followed, the echoes of that meeting rippled through my life and the lives of those I had confronted. There were attempts at reconciliation, cautious and tentative, as some family members grappled with the reality of my refusal to return to old patterns. Others withdrew, uncomfortable with the changes I embodied. But I remained steady, anchored by the certainty that I had chosen the path of authenticity and freedom over submission and silence. The climax of my journey was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but by the quiet, unwavering assertion of my humanity. It was a declaration that dignity is not granted but claimed, that voice is not given but taken, and that the power to define one's life lies within, waiting to be embraced. In standing firm, I had not only reclaimed myself, but had also opened the door for others, women like me, who had been silenced and sidelined, to find their own strength and speak their own truths. This moment, the peak of my emotional and personal arc, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of self-love. It was proof that even after years of betrayal and erasure, it is never too late to rise, to claim one's place, and to live fully and freely. The black dress remained hanging in my closet, a quiet reminder of the woman I had been and the woman I had become, a woman who would never again be invisible. And so, as the sun set on that chapter of my life, I embraced the new dawn ahead with open eyes and an open heart, ready to continue the journey of healing, connection, and unapologetic existence. The days following the confrontation settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost foreign after the years of turmoil and silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm that was both fragile and profound. In this stillness, I found a space to breathe, to reflect, and to finally begin to heal. The black dress, once a symbol of mourning and exclusion, now hung quietly in the back of my closet, its presence a reminder not of sorrow alone, but of survival and transformation. I no longer needed it to mark my grief or my isolation. Instead, I wore the lessons of my journey like a second skin, a testament to the resilience that had carried me through darkness and into light. Living alone in my apartment overlooking the freeway, I've grown accustomed to the steady hum of life beyond my windows. That noise, once an intrusion, has become a comforting backdrop, a reminder that the world moves forward regardless of the pain and challenges we face. I have learned to find peace in routine. The morning sunlight filtering through the curtains, the quiet cup of tea shared with a book, the occasional call or visit from friends who have become chosen family. These simple pleasures ground me in the present and remind me that joy and connection are still possible, even after profound loss. The family I once knew remains distant, their attempts at reaching out sporadic and often fraught with unspoken tension. Some have retreated into silence, unwilling or unable to reconcile with the changes I have made. Others offer tentative gestures of goodwill, cautious and measured. I accept these moments without expectation or bitterness, understanding that healing is a journey not just for me, but for them as well. I have come to see that love in its truest form cannot be demanded or forced. It must be earned and freely given. My refusal to return to old patterns has created space for new kinds of relationships, defined by honesty and respect rather than obligation and control. Writing has become my refuge and my voice. The pages of my journal hold the stories I was once too afraid or too silenced to tell. Through writing, I reclaim my history and assert my identity beyond the confines of family drama. Each word is an act of defiance and affirmation, a way to honor the life I have lived and the woman I have become. I am learning that storytelling is a powerful tool for healing, transforming pain into understanding and isolation into connection. There are moments, of course, when the ache of loss returns, when memories surface unbidden and the weight of years spent unseen presses down. But these moments no longer define me. They are threads woven into the larger tapestry of my life, adding depth and texture rather than unraveling the whole. I have come to embrace the complexity of my emotions, allowing myself to feel grief, anger, love, and hope without judgment. This emotional honesty has opened doors to greater self-compassion and acceptance. To any woman who finds herself in the shadow of betrayal, exclusion, or silence, I offer this: your pain is real, your voice matters, and your story deserves to be heard. Do not let anyone diminish your truth or dictate the terms of your existence. There is strength in standing alone, courage in speaking your truth, and freedom in claiming your life on your own terms. Healing is not linear, and the journey is often fraught with setbacks, but every step toward authenticity is a victory. My life now is not defined by what I have lost, but by what I continue to build, a life of dignity, connection, and purpose. I carry the scars of the past not as burdens, but as reminders of my resilience. The black dress remains in my closet, a silent witness to the chapters written in shadow and light. It is a symbol not of defeat, but of survival and transformation. And as I move forward, I do so with the quiet assurance that I am enough, just as I am. In this quiet space of acceptance and renewal, I have found peace. The journey from invisibility to agency has been long and arduous, but it has led me to a place of profound understanding and strength. I am no longer defined by the roles others assign to me, but by the woman I have chosen to become. And in that choice, I have discovered the deepest kind of freedom, the freedom to live fully, authentically, and unapologetically.